L. Ron Hubbard said the universe was 76 trillion years old, so I think the last presentation was a load of crap. Welcome, thanks for coming. I'm going to have a little bit of a difficult time with the time frame, so I'm going to just get cracking on this. We're going to talk about several different things. I'm just going to move over here so I can see my screen. We're going to talk about the basic development of Scientology and why it is that they developed a hatred of psychiatry. We're going to look at the conceptual bases, the actual sort of thoughts that they use to sort of underpin the ongoing expression of that war against psychiatry. We're going to introduce a little bit of sort of examples of Scientology's anti-psychiatry efforts today, which is just a little smattering of what these folks do and say, and how it's sort of been incorporated into society, and how we've actually, as a society, come to accept some of this stuff almost by stealth. And we're going to sort of finish up by thinking a bit more critically and skeptically about this whole issue. So there is Mr. Hubbard. I would encourage all of you to compare the Scientology version of his personal biography with the objective versions of his personal biography. It's quite an amazing story, an amazing contrast. His claim to fame was that he was actually a fairly prolific writer of short stories and pulp fiction, starting in his early 20s. By the late 1930s, he had moved into science fiction, and to this day, no human being has ever published more words than L. Ron Hubbard. That's sort of an example of the kind of magazine he moved into with his science fiction, astounding science fiction. Is a magazine that played a role in his future development as well. On the underside of L. Ron Hubbard is a series of failures, and I would submit to you that part of what sensitized him later on to developing an enemy such as psychiatry, or being prone to develop any other kind of external enemy, was this sort of undercurrent of failure and inadequacy, no matter sort of what his successes ostensibly were. So he went to university for 2 years between 1930 and 1932 and tried to study civil engineering and essentially flunked out. In the 1940s, his effort in World War II was likewise problematic. His father was a fairly successful career Navy man, and when Ron became an officer in the United States Navy himself during the war, he did briefly command an anti-submarine ship. He never saw any direct combat, and his difficulties with command are quite legendary. He left the war in 1945 suffering from chronic duodenal ulcers. He was hospitalized with epigastric distress when the rest of the country was celebrating the war victory. He took some pretty heavy meds for these problems, and he ended up receiving a VA pension for his physical ailments as of 1948. He later said that he would cure those ailments himself with his early Dianetics work. However, he kept the $55.20 pension for a lot longer than that. Very interesting to our story is also L. Ron Hubbard's mental health. And this is a fairly famous letter that he wrote in 1947, again to the VA, basically saying he has not adjusted well to society after the war. He's got periods of deep depression, moroseness, suicidal thinking, and he had been on some medication in the past and could please see a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst for treatment. It's unknown whether the VA ever responded to him appropriately. There's no record that I'm aware of that sort of shows that he specifically saw anyone, but this is sort of this famous 1947 begging letter. So I'm painting this kind of challenged, failing picture, but he was able to pull it together in the late 1940s. He got back to his writing. And this is where he turned the corner. This, again, is outstanding science fiction, May 1950. You can see in the corner, he publishes a long article called Dianetics, A New Science of the Mind. This is his version of mental health science and mental health treatment that he had sort of worked up over some time. He published it in Astounding Science Fiction because his efforts to publish it in the American Journal of Psychiatry and the American Journal of Psychology were both understandably met with rejection. Following this, the month after, he published his book, Dianetics, which was 400 pages at the time, a major, huge book, and it took off. He made a lot of money off of it to begin with. He sold it. He made it popular, and this was the real turning point. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the sort of theory of Dianetics, other than to point out that it is something that he basically was stimulated to get into by cribbing a lot of psychoanalytic thought at the time. There's a whole understanding of the origins of Dianetics, but basically it's there in a nutshell. I'm not going to touch that other than to talk about how part of the Dianetic issue goes back to prenatal experiences, and if you've been sort of traumatized or been knocked around. He's a very misogynist way of thinking in his book, but life as a fetus was pretty rough, according to Hubbard. Dianetics basically fell apart very soon after it was created. Within a year or so, he had put his first ever queer on stage in Los Angeles. She failed miserably. He started to fight with his colleagues. He started to pocket more money than he ought to have. And his Dianetics project was basically panned in reviews by a lot of professionals. The reason why he would be reviewed in the Journal of the American Medical Association or the American Psychiatric Association was people really bought into Dianetics, and they were doing it all across America. And this book was selling like crazy. There were Dianetic groups, there's Dianetic practices, and the medical folks of the day were quite disturbed that people would not get appropriate medical care and instead do this populist do-it-yourself type of approach. The other interesting thing is that he was also panned by his science fiction community as well, and those kinds of pulp magazines that we saw an image of. A lot of people would write in and say Dianetics is a load of rubbish and what is our guy thinking of? Scientology does not advertise that these days, and instead conceptualizes why they dislike psychiatry as psychiatry's response to L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics right back in 1950. We're going to see right now it's not true. He quickly, once Dianetics failed, managed to reinvent himself yet again in 1952 with the creation of Scientology. He had to do that for his survival because he had actually lost control over the term and the franchise of Dianetics, so he was not able to use the word anymore. He incorporated Scientology into Scientology, sort of a large cosmology where instead of going back to the womb, he went back generations and generations of sort of previous lives and implants over trillions of years. It was also had a bit more of a spiritual bent. That's where this concept of fate, sort of an immortal life spirit inside all of us, came from.